All right, so now we're going to get started. Welcome to today's webinar, Classroom Management Strategies to Support All Learners. My name is Tessie Bailey, and I'm the Director of the Progress Center and Advisor for the National Center on Intensive Intervention. I'm pleased to welcome you today. Today's webinar is co-hosted by the Progress Center and the National Center on Intensive Intervention. The Progress Center is a federally funded program focused on promoting progress for students with disabilities through the development and implementation of high-quality educational programming. The National Center on Intensive Intervention supports states and local educators in the implementation of intensive intervention for students with severe and persistent learning, emotional, social, and behavioral needs using database individualization. You can learn more about both of these centers and all of the resources that they provide, as well as access the recording from today by visiting promotingprogress.org or intensiveintervention.org. Now, I am so pleased to welcome today's presenter, Dr. Caitlyn Majeika. She is a senior researcher at the American Institutes for Research, where she supports a portfolio of research and evaluation efforts related to special education and multi-tiered system of support. She has extensive expertise and knowledge of classroom management and positive behavioral interventions and supports, often referred to as PBIS. She also has expertise in intensive intervention and provides knowledge development for the National Center on Intensive Intervention. Welcome me and joining Dr. Caitlyn Majeika.
Thanks, Tessie. Hi, everyone. As Tessie mentioned, my name is Caitlyn Majeika, and I'm excited to be with you today for our webinar on classroom management. And as Tessie shared, I'm a former classroom special education teacher at the elementary and middle school levels. And since then, my research and training for teachers has focused on behavior supports and classroom management, and I'm excited to share some more strategies with you today. So to get a sense of who's in the room, in the chat, if you want to share your name, your location, and your current role. And then to connect to a scenario we're going to share in a moment, any sort of restaurant that feels very nostalgic to your childhood. Welcome. We got a good mix of people from all over, some teachers, some faculty members, advocates. Ooh, some of you are in a lot warmer places than Nashville that's buried in snow right now. Oh, I do see someone else from Nashville, though. Welcome, Jennifer. Oh, and some great restaurants. So I grew up in the Northeast, and for me, the most nostalgic childhood restaurant is Newport Creamery. And so if you've been around one, you know they have the best milkshakes ever. And as a child, nothing hit better than those dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets. So that to me is the equivalent of like the most nostalgic childhood restaurant. And I see some of you, some Friendly's fans. Oh, Pizza Hut. Man, their buffet, nothing was better than that. Cracker Barrel. Welcome. And now that I've sufficiently made everybody hungry, we are going to now think about classroom management strategies. So we're here to talk about foundations of classroom management. And I know everyone brings different levels of foundational knowledge to the table. So if you can add in the chat a rating of 0 to 4 of your kind of familiarity and comfort with classroom management strategies to get a sense of where everyone is. Great. Okay. I see we do have a really nice range of different comfort. And so as Tessie mentioned, you know, we are going to, we had some great questions asked. We're going to try to address kind of everyone at the level they're at. And I really encourage you as we have these moments of reflection and opportunities to engage, you're kind of bringing your knowledge and expertise to the table for that. So today on the agenda, we are going to set the stage with an example related to the restaurant question that I asked you. We're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about just what is behavior in general and why does that matter as a teacher or a person who interacts with individuals in classroom settings. And then we're going to go over 3 foundational classroom management strategies: setting clear behavioral expectations, behavior-specific praise, and thinking about embedding opportunities to respond in our instruction. At the end, we're going to spend a little bit of time also thinking about those students who might need a little bit more, those students with more intensive needs. And then at the end, we're going to share a whole slew of resources and reflect on the day as well. So let's get started and set the stage for thinking about us interacting with the environment as adults. So we live in a time where the rise of the fast casual restaurant is upon us. And by fast casual, I mean restaurants where you order at a counter, they give you a number, you sit down, somebody delivers the food to you, and you're on your way. There aren't really wait staff, somebody coming to your table, taking your order. They're very fast casual. And so I want to know, too, how many of you, reaction in the chat, have eaten at one of these restaurants? I see some people raising their hand doing that. Awesome. Great. So if you're dining at one of these fast casual restaurants, you're sitting at a table, you finish with your meal. You typically have in front of you probably some dishes, some silverware, a tray, and maybe even some trash you need to throw away. So the question is, what do you do with them? You know, there isn't a wait staff that's there to clear your table. So what do you do with these? And if you don't know, what are some things you can do to help you figure it out? So in the chat, tell me what you would do, or if you don't know, what you would do to figure out what you need to do with your tray and your dishes. Okay, I see some great examples in the chat already. Awesome. These are some really great examples. I see that you can clear your tray. You can look around and see what else, observe others to see what they're doing. You can imitate your peers. You can ask somebody kind of what the protocol is here. Great. Awesome. Look for those labeled bins. Lots of options for you can do. Does anyone else besides me feel concerned in that moment that you want to do the right thing, right? You want to do what the restaurant expects of you, correct? I know I'm a rule follower, and so I want to do what's right. Okay. So we see that we have a variety of options. So let's consider a situation where you're dining, you get to the end of the meal, you have your tray, you have your dishes, you look around, and it's not really clear where the trash even goes or where to put the tray. And so you decide, like many of you suggested, I'm going to look around and see what other people are doing. So you look around and you notice that the majority of people are leaving their tray, leaving their dishes on the table, and walking away to exit the establishment. So you think, okay, this is what most people are doing. I'm going to make this decision and do it myself. How many of you, thumbs up or yes, have made this decision yourself to leave the tray on the table? I see some people raising their hand. Awesome. I have absolutely done that as well. That's what people are doing. So let's think about this scenario even further. So you've made that decision. Other people are doing it. You get up to leave and you're stopped by a member of the restaurant staff that kind of has a curt tone with you and says, hey, you left your tray and your dishes on the table. You're supposed to clear those and put them over here. And they point to this bin on the other side of the wall, kind of hidden in an area you can't see. How would you feel in that moment when that restaurant worker kind of gave you the direction of what you were supposed to do? How would you feel in that moment? Totally. Ashamed, embarrassed, mortified, annoyed. Absolutely. Attacked. I would feel the absolute same way. Confused, right? Again, for me, as the rule follower, I want to do what is right. And so in that moment, I would probably feel like, oh no, I didn't do what was right. And I might also feel a little bit defensive, right? How was I supposed to know that that was the expectation when it's not clear to me? And also I might feel, well, you know, I'm the only one doing this. Why am I the only one being spoken to? Okay. And so what we see in this scenario, that even as adults, we're interacting in the world at a restaurant, something that's supposed to be casual, we see with a lack of predictability in the environment that we might not have the most positive experience. We might all have different experiences, and we might not always know what to do. So what could the restaurant have done if they were concerned that the patrons were not clearing their trays, clearing their dishes, doing what they expected? What could the restaurant owners or management team have done to ensure that people were following their expectations instead of just walking away? Or what have you seen happen? Great. So communication with a sign. Ooh, someone noted a friendly sign. Clear sign on the trash. Great. Communicate the expectations. Great. Absolutely. So it's clear to us, right? Well, they should have just done this. And I've seen restaurants do this really well. On the tray, there's a little note that says, thank you for clearing this, and shows you where to go. They have well-labeled bins near the trash where your silverware, your plates, your trash goes. You might have staff members who remind you as you order your food, hey, when you're done with your meal, please bring them to the busing station. So many options that you mentioned could do, and that makes the environment more predictable for you as a patron. And you don't have that moment of panic at the end of, oh gosh, what am I supposed to do with this? Given that kind of this fast casual is a newer way of dining for us, for those who grew up in a place where we had wait staff who typically did that at the end of the meal for us. So what do fast casual restaurants have to do with classroom management? Well, in a classroom, we also want to ensure that our students are engaging with the environment in a way that feels predictable, and that we, as people who maybe are running the classroom, coaching, training future educators, do so in a way that makes it clear we want a well-structured and predictable classroom environment where all of the students understand the expectations and can meet them. And this is so that we improve access to and enhance the benefit from the general curriculum. So this is the whole point, is to make sure that students are accessing the curriculum. And this is essential for all students, but we know it is particularly essential for students with disabilities or students who have intensive needs. So today we're really going to think about that classroom environment and how we can shape that to ensure we're creating a well-organized, predictable environment that students are able to access and engage in that feels positive as well. So let's start just thinking about classroom management. When people hear this term, it means different things to different people. Some people have positive connotations or expectations with it. Sometimes they're more negative. So when you hear me say classroom management, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? Go ahead and put that in the chat. Great. Structure, systems, rules and expectations. Students are engaged. It's proactive. Consistency. Great. Procedures. Knowing the expectations. Positive. Rituals or routines. Organization. Great. Making things predictable. Absolutely. Some really great words to describe kind of components of classroom management. So before we dive in, we want to make sure that we are all on the same page, that when I'm using this term classroom management, we have a shared understanding of what it is, but we also know what it's not. Because sometimes people can hear this term and automatically think of it in a more negative light, or it is that something that it's not. So classroom management is a system to create an environment that's facilitating learning. So it's really about the environment we're cultivating in the classroom. We're thinking about it as a framework for teacher behavior, and it's a way that will benefit all learners, but particularly those with disabilities. It is not a system of rewards, tangibles, and bribes. Our goal here is not to try and control or punish students using a sticks and carrots approaches. It's not something that we only need in specific settings or only when we're working with a certain population of kids. And it's not only for students with disabilities. This is systems and programs for all students. And it's really important that we have this shared understanding going into what we're going to learn today with the strategies. In addition, when we think about classroom management, we want to think about it's important for two groups of people. Teachers first. Classroom management strategies are going to help shape that teacher behavior. And this is going to help create that structured environment that makes those expectations explicit. And a lot of you in your responses to when you heard classroom management, a lot of you thought about creating structure, creating an organized environment, setting those expectations. Absolutely. So we really want to think of that teacher's involvement in that and the important role teachers serve in that. We also know that there are benefits when a teacher has really strong classroom management practices that students benefit in addition to the teachers. So we know that students benefit from a predictable environment with clear expectations. Okay, so think back to us as an adult, how we might feel in a restaurant when the situation is not that predictable. And this is low stakes, right? This is just eating some tacos with your friends. But students who are in classroom settings for most of their day, especially those who might have challenges with learning, thinking about the importance of creating that predictable environment with clear expectations is essential. We also know that it's really important that we're using this classroom management to cultivate a positive learning environment where students can access the curriculum, but it also feels like a positive place to learn and it does not feel punitive all of the time. And then at the end of the day, we also want to make sure that we're facilitating access to instruction regardless of the setting. So now that we are on the same page about classroom management, let's take a moment and think about behavior, kind of this unit we always think of when we're thinking about classroom management. We want to promote those positive behaviors in students. So behavior is learned. From children all the way to adults, behavior is learned through interactions with our environment. And we cannot assume that children know rules, expectations, or social skills in your setting. What's critical here is that your classroom is one setting of many that students engage with. And there might be different expectations, social skills needed across the settings. And so we can't assume that students just, oh, they've been in classrooms before, they know. We need to make it clear what the expectations are in this setting, in this classroom. And we know that as teachers, you play an important role, that every social interaction a teacher has with a child teaches them something. And so we really want to use that to teach them the expectations, teach them the skills we want them to engage in to set them up for success. So often we think about behavior in this 3-term contingency. And all that means is we're thinking about a behavior, so kind of thinking about how we want students to engage in pro-social behaviors more and engage in problem behaviors or those non-expected behaviors less. And we can think about around that are parts of the environment that teachers can work on. So we think about antecedents, which just means something that comes right before a behavior, and consequences. So consequences is not associated with positive or negative. It's just simply something that happens directly as the result of a behavior, what comes after. So today, the classroom management tips are really thinking about what we can do in the environment. So those antecedent strategies, how can we prepare this environment to make sure that students are engaging in behaviors that are pro-social in nature, that are expected? And then how can we ensure the consequences? So what happens after the student engages in those behaviors reinforces that and ensures students want to engage in those behaviors more. So today we're really going to think about those antecedent and consequence approaches. All right, so let's dive in. We're going to go over 3 strategies. I'm going to present a strategy, define it, share some considerations for you, and then we're going to have a moment for you all to reflect. And what I really want you to bring to this is your own expectations, experiences, your role. And I'm going to ask you to kind of think about in your own classrooms, if that's where your role is, kind of how you can apply this strategy or do something different with it tomorrow. But also over the next month, how could you strengthen this approach as well? So let's start with setting clear behavioral expectations. And setting expectations, it's something a lot of you commented in the chat was something that came to mind when you heard the term classroom management, and really is the foundation of creating a predictable, organized environment that is conducive for you and for the students as well. So let's start with thinking about a definition for what behavioral expectations are. These are just statements of behaviors that you expect or want all students to engage in. And we know that at the class level, we want teachers to create expectations that are linked to school-wide expectations, if in any ways possible. They are to be stated positively. So we're focusing here on what we want the students to do. Again, we're using this as a moment to teach them and give them those skills that we want them to engage in. We want to make sure we define them and that it's not a laundry list of 45 expectations. We're prioritizing 3 to 5. And so I've embedded some quotes here that have stuck with me from my teacher training. And one of my student teaching supervisors, Linda Thompson, I remember one day after I was frustrated with a small group reading lesson, she said, You know, classroom management, effective classroom managers make seen their unseen expectations. And what she was pointing out is I had expectations for how I wanted students to engage with me during my small group lesson, how I wanted students to interact with the materials, and they weren't doing it that way. And I was getting frustrated, but I had never clearly communicated to them what my expectations were. So she sat down with me and helped say, okay, what are your expectations for these small groups? And how can we communicate and teach the students to engage in that way? And that was the first time I realized that I did have expectations. I did have assumptions for how a student would interact with me during this group time. And I had not taken the time to make that clear to them. And it was causing a source of frustration. And so this line always sticks with me from Dr. Thompson about making seen those unseen expectations that we all have. So here are some examples of positive expectations, and know that it's important that at every level, they're going to look a little bit different. So I'll give you a moment to read over these. And so here, what you might notice is these are pretty brief, broad statements. And what we would want to do is to add examples and non-examples with the students to really make it clear what they look like. But we want to make sure the expectations are kept kind of at that broad level. And then we use those examples and non-examples to make them more specific for students. Here are some considerations. And so here, whether you're developing them for the first time, whether you have expectations and you want to make sure that they support all students, here are some things to keep in mind. When you're setting expectations with the students, it's important to explain the purpose of why you're doing that. Explaining that you want to make the environment organized and predictable, and making sure that they know how to meet the expectations is very important. We also want to make sure that when we're creating expectations, it's usually very appropriate to create them with the students in mind, teacher led. But we also want to make sure that we're considering kind of individual needs of students. So students with disabilities, we're considering the intersection of disability, race, ethnicity, culture, and community when we're having these conversations. As part of the resources shared here, there's a really great culturally responsive field guide from the Center on PBIS that talks about setting behavioral expectations in the classroom that honors behavioral expectations or norms that students might have in their homes or in their community that might be in direct conflict with those in the classroom, and how you can have really powerful conversations to honor those behaviors that are expected or normal in different environments, but that might need to look different to interact with a classroom setting. And so that really honors kind of what students can expect outside of school, but also help show how it's important that we find ways to be successful in school as well. This goes along with making sure that students know behavior expectations are going to vary by setting or context. You might have a classroom full of students, and you might have another set of expectations for when you pull small groups or centers, or for students that have laptops for their laptop time. And that's perfectly appropriate that we might have additional expectations during those times, but it's important for students to know they might vary slightly for those settings and context. And we can share examples. And most importantly, we want to teach, model, and reinforce expectations multiple times. And what's really great about having a webinar at this time of year is many of you are coming off that holiday break. If you live in Nashville, we also have a week full of snow days right now. And so there's a lot of disrupted learning time. And so this is a really great time to think about resetting those behavioral expectations. And it could be teaching, modeling, and reinforcing the ones you set in September, or really thinking, hey, this was or was not working for the first semester. How can we approach this differently for the second semester? And using this as a really powerful time to reset and regroup and think about those behavioral expectations. So now is the time when we're going to take a moment to reflect and think about how we can apply this strategy. So I wrote this as if you were in a classroom setting, but if this doesn't apply to you, if you're in the role of a coach or a professor, kind of do this in a way that works for you. What can you do tomorrow to ensure that you or the people you teach or coach or support have clear behavioral expectations? But also, what could you do over the next month? So we want to think a quick win that we can do to kind of build that momentum, but also over the next month, what is a more longer term strategy that we could use to think about setting or ensuring that we have appropriate behavioral expectations? Take a moment to reflect and then add those to the chat. Great. Thanks for those of you who are kicking us off. We're going to review. And what I love about these is kind of not only are we reviewing them, but we're reviewing them, the expectations for specific context or for specific parts of the classroom, using a Kahoot to review expectations. Great. Bringing in some engagement, collaborate and work with people, model them. Ooh, I love this. Asking if expectations are confusing. And sometimes students might be able to tell you which ones are. And sometimes as a teacher, you might kind of have to watch as they're practicing to see if some of them are confusing, but I love that. Thinking about visuals, incorporating gestures, again, thinking about a wide range of students, that written expectations might be great for some, but gestures or visuals paired with them might be really helpful for others. Great, revisiting at the beginning of the day and reminder before starting the day. There is never too much reminding about behavioral expectations, especially at the lower elementary level. Remind as they enter, great. Pre-corrections are very useful. Ooh, I love this as a coach, being intentional about observations of expectations. I love that, being really intentional about how you're coaching and observing other teachers. Great, explaining what the students are doing well. These are really great examples and actionable examples as well of how you can embed this. And what's great is whether you have a great set of expectations or you really need to reframe them, all of these strategies can be applied depending on where you are. Great, providing positive support. Awesome. Well, Carrie, you are leading us into our next strategy after I share some resources. So here are some resources if this is an area that you want to work on yourself. As coaches, you want to support teachers. If you want to prepare pre-service teachers for these roles, here are some strategies that can help you kind of learn more, track some information, or here's that PBIS cultural responsive field guide that I mentioned as well. So really great and powerful resources if you want more information or want to dive into this area deeper. So speaking of ensuring students know when they are meeting expectations, strategy 2 is behavior-specific praise. Okay. Just like setting expectations, this is a foundational skill of classroom management. It is an area of positive reinforcement. And all we mean by that is that reinforcement is a consequence, so something that happens after a behavior that increases future likelihood of that behavior happening. And so praise is an example of positive reinforcement. We're telling the student something, we're saying it after the behavior. And if that behavior is increasing in the future, that is an example of positive reinforcement. Behavior-specific praise positively acknowledges the expected and appropriate behavior. So we take all of that time reviewing, modeling, practicing behavioral expectations. We don't just want to leave it at that. We want to ensure the students know when they have met the expectations. And this might be even more important for students with disabilities who need that additional interaction with the teachers to know when they've met them. Now, it is easy, and I'm going to say I did this as a teacher myself. It is very easy to fall into the good job column here, these non-specific statements. And while those are, they have their own place, the behavior-specific praise is where we get the most bang for our buck. That is letting the student know specifically what they did that was aligned with the expectation. Because if not, a great job, they could be thinking, oh, she thought I was doing X when really you were praising Y. And so we want to make sure that our behavior-specific praise matches and is aligned with the expectations. And it's especially important for those students who are engaging in this behavior frequently and those who are really trying to work towards that. Here, it also helps to clarify when a student is engaging in behavior that aligns with expectations. So someone had commented earlier about, making sure that if there's any confusion about expectations, awesome to have that conversation, pair that with praise so that they know, hey, you're meeting the expectation is really powerful. And we want to make sure that praise is used in an authentic way that's going to help create a positive classroom environment where students are engaging in the behavior expectations, and then they receive reinforcement for that, so they know that they're meeting those expectations. And it helps to establish a ratio, typically about 4-to-1. It probably should be a little bit more higher for the praise, but we know that reprimands are going to be needed, redirection is going to happen, and that is fine. But the environment starts to tilt a little bit more towards the punitive or negative if we don't have a sufficient number of praise statements kind of insulating that classroom environment to withstand those redirections. And here it's particularly important for students who maybe have not been meeting the expectations. And I know when I was a classroom teacher, this is something I had specifically had to work on, specifically had to make sure that I wasn't just using the good job or you got it, and I was using behavior specific praise, because it didn't come naturally to me until I kind of was a little bit further along in my tenure. So with behavior specific praise, just like setting expectations, you want to make sure you take some considerations in mind when thinking about implementing this practice in your classroom. So first and foremost, praise is great, but only if it's going to be reinforcing for the student. And so we want to make sure that it's developmentally and age appropriate, and that it matches student preferences. So for example, some students may love and want verbal praise in front of the whole classroom. You have some students who are like, yes, please tell me what I'm doing, and I want every single person to know. Others may be mortified, and if you praise them in front of the class or other people, they will never do that behavior again. So it's really important that we're praising in a way that kind of meets the students where they're at. And it might mean thinking in some creative ways about how to deliver praise to students. So on a Post-it note, thinking of creative ways to use technology in the classroom, kind of using some sort of symbol or sign that you can kind of pair with something that other students might not see, and making sure that that's not preventing us from delivering the behavior specific praise, and it's not going to turn into something that has a student making sure that they don't engage in any expectation because they don't want the praise in a way that's not conducive for them. So let's think about applying strategy 2. Take a moment, reflect on your current practices, the people you work with, instruct, the students that you teach, your own classroom perhaps, and think about your use of behavior-specific praise. Again, we're going to do the same. What can you do in your classroom tomorrow? And then separately, over the next month, what is a more long-term plan that you could use to increase the behavior-specific praise you're using in the classroom? And after you've reflected, go ahead and put that in the chat. Oh, practice at home on your family. I love this. It does take practice because it doesn't always feel natural, but I'm telling you, once it clicks, it does. So starting at home, I love that example. Oh, and just to address, I see Sandy's clarification question, that 4-to-1 ratio. In the classroom, and this is kind of on average, we don't need like for every child, it needs to be a 4-to-1, but on average in the classroom, if you're using 4 redirects or reprimand, we would expect that you have 4 times as many praise statements. So we want to walk into a classroom and hear 20 praise statements, and then maybe only a couple redirects or reprimands to make sure that we're creating that positive environment. But it doesn't have to be that, oh, I've reprimanded this student, so I have to make sure I get 3 in immediately. It's just on average, we don't want any student to be receiving more redirections or reprimands than praise statements. Oh, I love this. There's some examples too of students who don't like that verbal praise. There are many of us that don't. So drawing symbols on the board to praise them. And if this is possible, I would challenge you if you could use different symbols to represent different behavioral expectations. And again, that student might not know, other students might not know, but that student gets it. Making yourself a checklist, continue to use that. And collecting data over time. Oh, I love this modeling for SEAs. Great. And some of you are doing this and just continuing to do that more and practicing that more. Great. And some of you are going to embed it within other ones. Absolutely. And Gary, you made a good comment that for some students, they are going to need a little bit more of that praise ratio to kind of make sure that they're on target. And kind of that's something that as a teacher, you're collecting data and you really want to think about kind of meeting the students where they're at. And that's a really good example of that. So we're also including in our resources this fundamental skill sheet from the Iris Center, which does a deep dive into kind of the research and historical nature of behavior-specific praise, why it's important, and some more tips and helpful guidance for that as well. And so this can be something that you could read to learn more, or if you're working with others, coaching others, this might be a good resource to share with them as well. All right, so we've talked about setting those expectations, thinking about those antecedents. How can we prime the environment to set students up for success? And then hopefully we have students who are engaging in those behavior expectations. And so the consequence that we're applying is providing some sort of behavior specific praise to let them know that they're meeting those expectations. So that helps to create an environment where students are engaging and meeting those behavioral expectations. So for the third strategy, I have chosen opportunities to respond as it pairs nicely with the first two and really does round out kind of this foundation of where we get the most bang for our buck when we think about classroom management. So what is an opportunity to respond? Some people might refer to this as OTRs, and it's simply a question, a statement, a prompt that solicits a response. So anytime I've asked you a question and you've responded in the chat, that's an example of an OTR I've used throughout this presentation. And note that for students or in a classroom, or even if you're training adults, responses can be verbal or they could be nonverbal. So for example, it could be calling on a specific student. It could be asking students to raise their hand or vote on something. They can be writing their answers down on a whiteboard and holding it up. Turning and talking with a peer, one I love to use in instructional settings, is an example of an opportunity to respond. And then also something some of you have mentioned, using things like a Kahoot poll or a way for them to engage with technology and fill out a survey and present it that way, or a game, all examples of opportunities to respond. And why is this important and included with classroom management? You know, typically we think about opportunities to respond when we think about academic instruction or interventions. What's really important and help promote behavior that we're expecting, promote engagement, is to make sure that we're including a fast-paced learning environment that includes opportunities for the student to engage with the content and not just sit there and listen. And another one of my professors from my pre-service teacher said something to us, kind of first day, Classroom Management 101. She's like, you're going to learn strategies, but I'm going to tell you your first line of defense for classroom management is an engaging lesson. And at first, when I heard this, I was like, she cannot be right. We're here to learn about classroom management. This is not to learn how to do a reading lesson well. I was like, this cannot be true. And then I became a teacher and learned, wow, she was right. The more students have opportunities to engage, the more that they are engaged and more likely they are to meet those behavioral expectations and also to interact with the content as well. And here we know that research supports this. The use of OTRs is important, especially for students with disabilities and for students with intensive learning needs. And so we know it's really important in a classroom environment. And it also sets the stage and makes it predictable that I'm going to be providing instruction, but the expectation is that you are engaging in this instruction as well. And so what's important here when we're thinking about embedding opportunities to respond throughout our lesson is that we want to make sure that we're varying the type of opportunities to respond used throughout each of the lessons. So what I mean by that is sometimes we can do opportunities to respond for the whole class. So for example, with you all, I asked a couple of questions and just said, put a reaction or a thumbs up. And this was less about you sharing ideas or content and me more getting a pulse on kind of the number of yeses or nos or agreement or disagreement. And sometimes these could be individual. So if you call on an individual student and ask them a question, this is a different type of opportunity to respond. And it's really important to have a good balance of both. Opportunities to respond are great because you also have formative assessment data. So if we're thinking about students and we want to have a brisk pace of instruction, that's only going to be effective and work if our students are following along with us. So these are also checks to make sure that our students are understanding the content, and you can intervene in a moment to know if there's a student or group of students that are falling behind, what you can do in those moments to kind of help reteach or review content for those specific students. We want to make sure that when you're planning your opportunities to respond, at first, I really encourage you to plan these out, write them down, think about these considerations. We do want to make sure that the response options accommodate for students, the needs of students with disabilities. And what I mean by this is if you have students who have difficulty writing and so they type their responses, not having many where students are writing on a whiteboard and perhaps we're using something like an online Kahoot poll instead. Or if you have students who might need to kind of prime their thinking or they need more time to process, making sure that they know, okay, I'm going to call on you next time after this student. I'm going to give you time to reflect on this. And then we also, this is a really great opportunity to praise and reinforce students for meeting classroom behavioral expectations. As we're going through the opportunities to respond, you're asking questions and they're answering. Great natural opportunity to reflect and respond to that. One more slide about opportunities to respond in students with disabilities or who have intensive needs. Really thinking critically, we don't want students to not be given opportunities to respond because we need to make them more accessible or it's more challenging. We really need to think ahead of time and make sure that we're, for all students, thinking about ways that all students can interact. And so to set students up for success, especially for students who might have academic challenges or might need, again, that time to process or extra opportunities to practice, things like using signals like, hey, I'm going to call on John first, and then I'm going to come to you, allows them time to think. Using multiple mediums, so choral responses, raising their hand, holding up color cards, responding on the computer, multiple mediums to allow different students to interact differently. Also, what can be really powerful is if you want a student to respond using a turn and talk and allowing them to talk with a peer first, and then saying, turn and talk with a peer, everybody, and then I'm going to call on this group to share, and I want so-and-so to provide the response for the group. So it's allowing them to think with a peer, interact, before having to share their response out loud with the class. And again, just making sure opportunities are accessible and that you're not always using OTRs that a student can't access because of a specific need they have. All right, our last time to think and apply. What can you do in your classroom tomorrow to enhance opportunities to respond? And then thinking long-term, what could we do over the next month? Add those in the chat after you've thought about it for a moment. Great. Oh, I love that. Draw a response, students who are more shy, or even students who might understand the content more resistant to share out loud, that turn and talk can be very powerful, absolutely. Turned into a game. Yeah, Julie, sometimes the OTRs get overlooked as a classroom management strategy, but they can be a really powerful tool. And especially important for students who we know need more opportunities to practice. So really important to think about that. Being an absolutely intentional planning, it's the same as praise. I was guilty of this myself as a teacher, thinking, oh, I can do this, I've got this. And then you get in the middle of a lesson and you're so excited about fractions, and then you realize you haven't asked the students a question and you haven't praised anyone. So really being purposeful about planning it out, timing yourself, collecting data, can be really powerful tools. Oh, I love it. I forgot the thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs sideways are great. I've used that in a lot of college classes I've taught as well. It's helped to get a quick pulse, accessible to all, most, I should say. Great. Keep those strategies coming as I'm going to move on and share some strategies. So the Center on MTSS has an assessment of opportunities to respond, great for self-reflection or as a coaching tool if this is an area you really want to focus on. The IRIS Center also talks about some additional behavioral strategies in their addressing challenging behaviors module. And then we also have some additional Progress Center modules as well, thinking about planning instruction and what teachers need to know, planning and delivering instruction. So we're going to get to our last part, and I know there are some questions and we should have some time to answer them. But there might be some of you thinking, these strategies are great and helpful for most, but there are going to be students who have more intensive needs, who need more. And absolutely, I agree with you. There's never going to be a system or a strategy that's 100% effective for all students on all days. So the 3 strategies I've shared are going to set a really solid foundation for all students, especially those with disabilities or intensive intervention needs. But I also want to acknowledge there are going to be students who need something more intensive in addition to what I've shared. And so some examples could be a class-wide support. And this would be in a situation where maybe you have a few students in a classroom that is disrupting the learning environment despite kind of having those foundational supports in place. And so something like a token economy or a game like class-wide, it's called CW Fit, class-wide function-based intervention teams, or the good behavior game, where students are earning points or tokens based on individual behaviors or team-based approach for meeting those behavioral expectations, can be really helpful to kind of promote a fun learning environment. And the CW Fit can be used even for students at the secondary level as well. And then there are going to be situations where you have individual students who are really struggling to meet those expectations, who really need a more intensive approach for teaching them those skills to meet the behavior expectations and reinforcing them. And so this may mean that we're looking into more adult mentors to support them, a peer buddy in the classroom, thinking about a targeted intervention like check in, check out, or social skills lessons, knowing that some classroom environments, some students are going to need more, and we want to make sure that we address that. And while this wasn't the focus of today, I do want to acknowledge there are other supports out there to make sure that those students get what they need. And so we're also going to include, when we share out the resources for some of those programs we shared, either the free websites you can check out or more information on where to go to look for those resources for those students, should they be in your classroom or you need to support teachers with those students as well. So we also wanted to take some time to share additional resources. We know, again, based on the rating, that all of you are at different places with your classroom management, and we're so excited you're here to learn with us today. We also wanted to share that the National Center on Intensive Intervention has an entire 8-course module on behavior support for students with intensive intervention needs. And so again, this could be for yourself or for those that you're training or coaching. They could take the entire 8-course module or pick and choose the areas that they want more support in. This is a really great resource and tool if you want to do a deep dive into these topics. We also know, I kind of dabbled in this with the opportunities to respond, but thinking about the intersection between strong classroom management and thinking about how we can support those students with disabilities or intensive intervention needs, especially for the academics. So the taxonomy of intervention intensity really bridges that gap between thinking about academic instruction and also thinking about how we can embed those principles of classroom management, the behavior support, into these academic supports for students as well. And then with the Progress Center, there is also an online module and then a resource on teaching social behaviors. So it is not enough to just post the expectations. We need to teach, model, reinforce those. And so what, as teachers, as coaches, as pre-service and educators, what do we need to know about teaching student social behaviors? These resources are going to give you information about that. And then, of course, our good partners at the Iris Center have modules and materials and content specifically focused on understanding student behavior and kind of how that applies to thinking about classroom management strategies as well. All right, so we made it to the end. And before we get to some of your questions, which I do want to get at, I want us to take a moment and think. We've spent some time thinking about what you could do tomorrow in your own setting, what you could do in a month, but what's something that stuck with you from today's session? And this could be something completely new you've learned, or something that resonated with you that you might have known but learned about it or thought about it in a different way today. So what is something that stuck with you from today's webinar? Great, Lisa, I'm glad the restaurant analogy resonated. This is my first time using that, and I was very excited about it, but you never know how those land. So it's nice to know somebody found that useful. Great. Feel free to use that as your training. Great, and yeah, it was helpful to reflect kind of short-term and long-term. Great. Absolutely, that there are materials and resources out there. It's just kind of important to find them, laser focus on what you need. Intentional and consistent. Classroom management absolutely is a framework for teachers and teacher behavior. Absolutely, expectations at the stage for teacher behavior, great. Oh, I'm so glad that you feel encouraged and that you're on the right track. Keep going. Keep going. Great. So now we're going to have an opportunity to answer a few questions before we wrap up. And I do want to start with one that I saw in the chat, and one of our hosts here had sent me as well, so it didn't get lost, about a student who is engaging in so much behavior that is in misalignment with expectations that it's really hard to do that 4-to-1 praise ratio. And I hear you. I acknowledge that there are going to be examples of that. And my advice for you is to think small. Don't let that 4-to-1 get in the way of you acknowledging what that student has done and making sure that you are finding opportunities to purposefully and meaningful praise that student. And I know it can be hard, right? You're focused on what's in front of you, teaching, and the redirections or the reprimands are kind of what happened. And so I would encourage you, for those in the planning, to make sure that you're finding as many opportunities as you can to praise that student, and then making sure that we're not letting that redirection, but it is hard. And I also would encourage you to kind of think about those additional, more intensive strategies that I shared that the student might just need more, and something like a game or a token economy to make sure that we are embedding more of those opportunities into the system as well.
Thanks, Caitlin. As a mom who has a kid, that sometimes I'm like, wow, I'm finding something. It's hard to find something to get positive praise about sometimes. I understand you all, but I agree that starting small. We did have a question that talks about good classroom management. Something you said earlier takes some time initially. And I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about that, because I think they're finding that some teachers say, I don't have enough time.
Totally. I hear that. And this was part of me as we were doing the reflection, thinking, okay, there are things you could do in your classroom tomorrow, but having you reflect on a month or longer was to show that a lot of these strategies take planning and time and purpose to do over the long term. This is not just something that happens overnight. And so I would encourage you all with this to think about, if you're in a classroom setting, what can I do with kids in front of me tomorrow? But how can I set myself up with a plan for what I want this to look like, how I want to change my classroom environment over the next month or so? And also to think about, again, reflect, someone asked about pearl of wisdom for guest teachers that they could implement tomorrow, is maybe not implementing, but really think about your role as the teacher and how important you are to shape the classroom environment. And so really being purposeful about your planning about what type of classroom environment you want, and kind of laser focusing on those foundational strategies to kind of start somewhere, build up your repertoire, and then over time. Because I will kind of end this by saying it can feel overwhelming to start hunting and pecking for resources and trying different things and they're not working. Pick something foundational: expectations, praise, OTRs, put it in place with fidelity and stick with it. Make small changes as needed. Don't try to keep changing or implement 5 new strategies at once. You don't have time for that. So you do have time to make things start small that work for you, to make a classroom where you do have more time to teach.
Yeah, I think that's good feedback. There are a couple of comments in the chat that's really around identifying the classroom routines that work for you.
Yes.
And start small. There was a question around, is there any differences between the way you approach classroom management at the elementary level versus the secondary level? And before you answer, I just want folks, you'll see that we've put up the evaluation. So please provide your feedback, but I do want to make sure we get to this question.
Thanks, Tessie. Absolutely. I think the I wouldn't say that the foundational components of your classroom management plan are vastly different across levels. Those should be present across any level that you're teaching, but the approach that you take for them might look a little bit different. For example, in middle school, my students were a lot more interested in helping me plan the expectations and figuring out a system for that. And they also, again, thinking about like the developmental nature of them, they had more opinions about kind of praise and the way they wanted to interact with it. So I would say that all of the strategies that we addressed today should be across environments, but the approach that you take for that and the planning and the involvement of the student might vary depending on the level and the capacity of the students to interact. And I also say that for the older students, there are going to be, technology is in a lot more schools. They are more likely to be engaging with technology, or you have to think about that element of a classroom that might not be something that elementary school teachers, and I feel like I'm just reading all these articles about the pros and cons of laptops and cell phones in school. And so at the older grades, I also feel like part of the classroom management and thinking about the environment is also thinking about the ways that we're using technology and how that does impact instruction and the learning environment for the students as well, whereas students at the elementary level probably aren't quite there yet.
Great. So I want to thank you, Caitlyn, for joining us today and sharing this. It was a lot of great feedback and chat in the actual chat box. And so if you haven't had a chance before you hop off, make sure you take a look at that. Please know that the resources that were shared today, the PowerPoint, are available on both the National Center on Intensive Intervention and the Progress Center. And if you'd like to keep up to date with all the new things that are coming out, make sure you follow us on social media and sign up for the newsletter for both centers. Thank you all again and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks all.